on motivation, and we're also going to discuss the issues related with emotions. When we talk about motivation, sometimes we think about instincts. Both humans and animals are born with some natural instincts, and instincts might come into conflict with each other. In this slide, I'm showing the mating of a particular insect. In the pictures, you see the bigger insect is a female, and the smaller one is a male. So they mate, and after they finish mating, something really interesting and strange happens. The female bites on the male, and the female eats its own mate. This is really an interesting phenomena in the animal world. It's rare, but it happens. If we look at the situation, we detect some instincts. Both male and female insects, they have the instinct of mating. Mating is a natural instinct. All animals who have a sexual reproduction, they mate. Humans have a mating instinct too. But between this pair of insects, the mating instinct, at least for the male, is coming into conflict with the survival instinct. Staying alive and survival is a very strong instinct. The evolutionary theory has a very cool and interesting explanation for this phenomenon. Suppose that there are some male insects of this type who do not mate. These insects will live longer, but they will miss the opportunity to have offsprings. They have no offsprings, and they will not leave their genes to the next generation. Their genes encoding the choice, the preference for safety, for personal safety, for their individual safety, for staying alive longer, will not be able to pass on to the next generation. On the other hand, those male insects who decide to take the risk and mate, they will leave their genes to the next generation because they will have offsprings. So over the evolutionary history, the risk-taking and mate-loving insects will have their genetic information from one generation to the next. And today, most males of this type would choose to take the risk and mate. So this is how some insects resolve the conflict between the desire or the instinct to stay alive, to be safe, and the instinct to mate. Animals, most animals, especially lower animals, have a very rudimentary, have very crude ways of solving conflicts in instincts between different incompatible instincts. They just choose one over the other, either or. Either you mate or you stay alive for longer time. But in humans also face a lot of conflicts in regulating their goals, regulating their instincts, behavior choices, decision making. But The human situation is way more complex, far more complex. Psychology has documented some typical conflict situations. In the human motivation arena, there are several types of conflicts. One type is approach conflict. If a person is trying to achieve two desirable outcomes, but can only choose one, and then there's approach conflict. For example, if you have two good job offers, you're really lucky. It's a really good conflict. It's a good worry. It's something good to worry about. If you have two good job offers, both pay well, both have good benefits, and both will provide opportunities to engage in something you really love professionally, but you can take only one position. Both are full-time jobs. You can only choose one of them, and you have an approach conflict. You have to resolve this conflict. Then another kind of conflict is called approach avoidance conflict. This would be a situation where you are facing with a situation of you want to approach a desirable outcome, but you want to avoid an undesirable outcome. So this opportunity would provide a possibility for achieving desirable outcome, but also pose a risk of undesirable outcome. The insect, the male in the pair of insects, this guy is facing an approach avoidance conflict. He wants to approach a desirable outcome of mating. He would love to mate, but he doesn't want to be eaten. He wants to avoid the possibility of being eaten by the female. This is a typical approach avoidance conflict. Humans sometimes face this kind of conflicts too. For example, smokers. They want to smoke. They have the craving for smoking cigarettes. But at the same time, most smokers know smoking is bad for their health. They want to avoid the possibility of lung cancer. So this would be a typical approach avoidance conflict. And if you look at the picture packaging in Canada, there's usually some gruesome pictures of lung cancer, of a person who are sick from cigarette smoking, printed on the package of cigarettes. Suppose a smoker pick up a pack of cigarettes and want to take one cigarette out of the pack and start smoking, and he has to look at this picture. This picture would create a lot of approach avoidance conflict. A smoker have a strong craving to smoke, but looking at this picture of a diseased lung, horrible picture of lung cancer, and he faces a really difficult situation, approach avoidance conflict. Sometimes an opportunity or a situation presents an avoidance conflict. For example, if you get an invitation to a party and you don't like the people that will be you will be meeting and mingling with at the party, but the person who invited you to the party is a good friend, and he or she would really love you to show up at the party. And now you face avoidance conflict. Number one, you would like to avoid disappointing your friend who invited you. That would you wouldn't feel very good about that. At the same time, you want to avoid the unpleasant experience of being at a party you don't like. You are in a band. You have to make some very difficult choices. That is avoidance conflict. And some smokers also face this kind of avoidance conflict. Some smokers believe that smoking keep their weight down. Some smokers believe that if they stop smoking, if they quit smoking, they will gain weight, which is sometimes true. So some smokers use this as an excuse that I don't want to gain weight. I want to avoid the possibility of getting fat. But at the same time, when they smoke, when they continue to smoke, they know it's not good for their health, not good for their lungs and heart. They also want to avoid the possibility of getting a heart attack. So these smokers would be facing avoidance conflict. And then, of course, the human situation is much more complex than approach, avoidance, conflicts. Sometimes we have a multiple approach, avoidance, conflict. Most situations, most conflicting situations would give rise to a multiple approach avoidance conflicts. For example, somebody who has a high bit of smoking but wants to quit would most likely face a multiple approach avoidance conflict. So obvious avoidance motivation would be to avoid harming your health. But then there are other factors to consider. You also want to avoid the unpleasant feeling of the withdrawal effects. For a person who is addicted to nicotine, to cigarette smoking, stop smoking can cause some serious withdrawal effects. So the strong craving, you really want to have a smoke, and the physical discomfort. Some people, when they quit smoking, when they stop smoking, they feel dizzy, they feel restless. Those unpleasant feelings caused by withdrawal effects is something they want to avoid. Of course, there are also situations they want to approach with respect to quitting versus continuous smoking. For example, they want to approach the positive outcome of quit smoking, such as having better skins, having better lungs, and having a more healthy and active lifestyle. But they also want to avoid the possibility of weight gain, and they want to avoid the possibility of losing a useful way, according to them, to control stress, to relax, to enjoy a conversation with their smoke buddies, socialization, etc. So people are faced with these multiple conflicts, approach avoidance conflicts, when making the decision to smoke or not to smoke. I have some research data showing the success rate of those people who try to quit smoking. It's very difficult to quit smoking, that's for sure. But if you look at the research results, most smokers want to quit. They want to quit smoking, they want to stop smoking, but it's difficult for them to do that. This shows how strong the conflict is. So the research shows that among all smokers, more than 80% of them, especially the young ones, for the young ones aged between 18 and 24, for this group, about 85% of them have tried to quit seriously over the last years. And they want to quit, but they continue to smoke. most of them have tried to quit, but how many of them, what percentage have been successful even for one day? If we continue to look at the young people age 18 to 24, about 50% of them are successful for quitting for one day. Even for one day is so difficult. And then what percentage of them are successful in quitting for 6 months, 6 months or more? For the young people 18 to 24, for only about 10%, less than 10% are successful in quitting for good, basically. And you can see the older the people get, the more difficult it is for them to quit. For the oldest age group, 50 to 64 years old, even for this group, more than 60%, 65% of them have tried to quit seriously over the past year, but their success rate even lower than the younger people. And this shows, I think one reason is older people tend to have a longer smoking history. They have been smoking for decades. They might start when they are 20 years old. Now they are 50. So they would have a 30-year smoking history. That built a lot of addiction, strong dependence. And it's even more difficult for them to quit, but still they want to quit. This shows conflict in motivation. Most likely, it would be a multiple approach avoidance conflict involved in smoking cessation. Resolving conflict in motivation is a key area for development, for personal development, and especially for moral development. Remember, we talked about Kohlberg's level of moral thinking. Kohlberg has this influential model of how people decide in terms of moral decision making, deciding what is right, what is wrong, what is the right thing to do in particular situations. According to Kohlberg, there are 3 levels of moral reasoning: the pre-conventional morality, conventional, and post-conventional morality. Kohlberg's method of assessment, the way Kohlberg measures people's moral reasoning ability, is focused on conflict. He looks at how people think about, rationalize, and reason about moral conflict. He would present a story, a scenario with a moral conflict. For example, his most well-known scenario would be a person whose wife, a man, his wife got cancer, and there's one kind of medication that can cure his wife's cancer, but the medication is really expensive. The pharmacist who has a medication sells it for a high price. So our hero, our character in the story cannot afford medication to save his wife. So he faces a conflict. Should he steal the medication? Should he sneak into the pharmacy and steal the medication to give it to his wife, to save his wife's lives? This is a moral conflict. It involves multiple avoidance conflict. There are some situations he wants to approach. Saving the life of his wife is one outcome he wants to approach, and then there are some scenario outcomes that he would like to avoid. For example, he doesn't want to be arrested by the police for stealing, for breaking into other people's properties. He does not want to be seen as a dishonest person, and he would like to approach the possibility of being viewed and being regarded by other people as being honest. So he faces a lot of conflicts. Actually, the way that Kohlberg judge people's moral reasoning ability is not about coming up with a right answer, correct answer. Actually, in many situations, in many moral reasoning situations, there's no one single answer that is correct or even the best. Kohlberg is looking for complexity. Kohlberg looks for how many factors, how many conflicting factors you take into your consideration in your process of making a moral judgment, moral decision. It's the complexity of the process. It's how many factors you take into consideration that is really the interest of Kohlberg's assessment. And Kohlberg's model of moral reasoning is based on how you resolve conflicts. At the pre-conventional level, it's really simple. It's really simple. You decide what's right and what's wrong based on your self-interest. You don't want to get punished. Whatever is gets you punished, gets you into trouble, that's something you don't want to do. That's wrong. And you want to gain some concrete rewards. And this is a simplistic way of resolving moral conflicts and motivation conflicts. And then as kids grow older, get more sophisticated in their cognitive abilities and get more socialized by their surroundings, environment, by society, they enter into the conventional morality stage. In this stage, they become good citizens, law-abiding citizens, and they become good members of society that meets the expectations of people around them. So their rule of resolving the moral conflict, decide decisions about what's right and what's wrong, is based on the conventions, the rule, the customs, what their religion tell them is right, what their parents expect of them, what their peers expect of them. This will be a conventional stage. The post-conventional stage is based on personal beliefs, personal decision-making. So you come up with a self-defined personal ethical principles. What do you believe to be right? This might come into conflict with society. For example, some historical stages, some societies have expectations, rules, conventions, or even laws that are not ethical. For example, in the 1950s, before the 1950s, the social rights movement, in the southern states of the United States, there were laws of racial segregation. Black people were not allowed to sit in the same area on the bars as the white people. Some of the restaurants or shops are whites only. African American people were not allowed to enter. So these were laws in some of those states. And most people living in that area and in that era would be at a conventional state of moral reasoning. They would obey those laws. They might disagree with those laws, but they have to obey. They play along. But some people are more advanced in moral reasoning and in their moral actions. For example, an African-American girl at that time living in Alabama, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, one morning when she was taking the bus to her school, she decided to violate the racial segregation law on the bus. She sat down in the white section of the bus, and she got arrested by the police officers for doing that. This action would demonstrate a post-conventional level of moral development. Human conflict is everywhere. Conflict in motivation, in decision-making is everywhere in human life. That's part of human life. So the ability to resolve conflict in motivation is the hallmark of human rationality. It's the hallmarks of human self-regulation. And many theories in psychology try to explain this ability or lack of ability in some people for resolving conflicts. The early theorists of psychology, for example, Sigmund Freud, were really interested in how people resolve conflicts. Also how conflicts cause problems for mental health. According to Freud, the human conflict, the source of human conflict is coming from the conflict between the id and the superego. The id, according to Freud, was unconscious instincts. He believes that humans have sexual instincts, libido, and aggressive instincts, which is related with a concept called death instinct. Of course, these instincts cannot be expressed freely in the human society. The society imposes restrictions on how you can express sexual instincts properly in a socially desirable way. And of course, a society has strong limitations and imposes strong sanctions against aggressive instincts. In order to avoid punishment and gain reward, gain good social standing, people develop this kind of a superego. This is mental structure, internal representation of society's expectations, rules, norms, moral values. Of course, laws are included too. So the superego is sometimes in conflict with the id, with the instinct. The individual part, the biological part of the person sometimes come into a conflict or get into trouble with the social part of the person, which is the superego. And then the ego plays a vital role of a go-between between the id and the superego. So the ego, if it is strong enough, would have the power of inhibiting the id, inhibiting the sexual instincts and aggressive instincts, so they become unconscious. If you are unaware of these nasty instincts, you are at peace with the society, with your superego, which is representative of society's expectations, values, rules in your mind. And then you have a peaceful mind, you have a mental peace. But if the ego is kind of weak, and then the id, the instincts threaten to express themselves, you would feel threatened. You would feel anxious, unsettled. You would lose your peace of mind because you might be punished by the society and also by your superego. This is how Freud explained anxiety, neurotic responses, mental disorders. It's focused on self-regulation, and resolving conflicts. Another way of explaining self-regulation, conflict resolution, and planning, goal setting, motivation is from the biological perspective. Self-regulation and self-management is part of the functions of the human nervous system, especially in the brain. In the 1800s, there were a well-known case study in the history of psychology. In the 1800s, the United States were building its railroad. And there was a railroad foreman, a railroad worker. His name was Phineas Gage. Mr. Gage was working on the railway building site. His job was take an iron rod. This is a metal rod. This is his tool. He uses this tool in his work to blow up rocks. When you are building the railroad, you don't want rocks to be in the way. Whenever you have a big boulder or big piece of rock that is in the way, you want to blow it up, get rid of it. So Mr. Gage would use the rod to dig a hole in the rock and then fill in dynamite and then set off the dynamite to blow up the rock. One day, he accidentally made a spark with his rod on the rock. So the dynamite was set off and the rod penetrated his head. So the rod entered from around his cheekbone and exited from the top of his head. It flew off quite some distance and landed on the ground. Miraculously, Mr. Gage survived. He didn't die. He didn't even lose conscious awareness. He was taken to the hospital, and then the doctors treated him, and he survived several years after the incident. During the several years after his accident, doctors made detailed observations of him. Doctors first, they localized his damage. His area of damage is restricted to the frontal lobe. Remember when we were talking about biological basis of human behavior, we talked we covered the different areas of cerebral cortex. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and then the occipital lobe, temporal lobes on the right and on the left. Mr. Gage, his damage was mostly in the frontal lobe. And the doctors documented his impairments, his dysfunctions. This way they can correlate the dysfunctions with the physical damage in the brain. This way they can have some understanding of the proper functions of normal frontal lobes. After the incident, after the accident, after trauma, Mr. Gage suffered some specific damages, mostly in reasoning, judgment, and decision-making. He became very impulsive. He does whatever he wants to do. And sometimes he becomes very verbally abusive. He curses and swears, and he lost his ability to make good plans, carry out actions, goal-directed actions. His employers used to like him a lot. Before the accident, his employers regarded him as a good worker, a very dependable. He was even a foreman. But after the accident, he had a lot of trouble holding on to the job. He could not do the job anymore. He even could not show up at work at the right time, in the right place. This case study shows us that the frontal lobe is responsible for the executive functions. So it's for planning, impulse control, judgment, decision making, and of course, it's related with motivation. It's related with anticipating the outcomes of potential action plans and making wise judgment and decisions. Resolving conflict and keeping your impulse in check is not always easy. It's not really easy, not easy at all. Let's do a demo. Let's do a Stoop task demo. This task was developed by a psychologist. His name was Stoop. Mr. Stoop developed this task in 1935. Let's first do the test and then explain what it shows. The instructions, when you see a word on the screen, name its color aloud. Name its color as fast as possible. So fast. Speed is important and accuracy is also important. Don't make mistakes and be fast. Let's do some practice to get familiar with the test. Well, when you see this word, you should say red. The word is printed in red font. I'm kind of slow, just for demo. I will be faster. For this one, it's green. Yeah, I'm really slow. Green. So let's do that again. Red, green, green, red, green, red. Okay, and let's start for real. You can do it yourself. Hopefully you can beat me. Be faster and more accurate than I am. Black, red, red, blue, no, red, 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 green, no, red. So you see, this one is more difficult. When you see the word green printed in red, you have a conflict. One conflict is to read the word red, no, green, yeah. And then, but this is a wrong response. You are supposed to name the color. The task is called a Stoop color naming test. So the correct response is to say red. The color is red, but the word is green. So you have a conflict between two responses. You have to make a choice, make the right decision. Fortunately, the rule of decision is clear. You have to name the color. And in this trial, it's easier. There's no conflict between reading the word and naming the color. They are corresponding to the same response. It's red. You just say red and you're faster and more accurate. Why do we have this kind of a phenomenon? Why is it more difficult to make the response in this trial? It's because there's conflict between reading the word and naming the color. And the word reading response is a stronger response. It's more automatic because we have been reading words all the time, starting from a very early age, from primary school when you start reading. But the color naming response is weak. It has a very short history. We don't just name colors in our everyday lives. And in other words, to make the right response, You have to inhibit the automatic, impulsive, strong response of reading the word. Keep it down. Don't do that. And you have to consciously, effortfully make the choice of responding by naming the color. This is a conflict situation. And habits can be really strong. You can, well, this also explains why smoking is so difficult to quit. Habits are very difficult to change because with over practice, a lot of practice over the years, the response becomes a habit. It becomes automatic. For smokers, their smoking behavior is tied up with many details of their everyday life. For many smokers, the moment they wake up, the first thing they want to do is to smoke a cigarette. And then it's their habit. It's very difficult to change. And for many smokers, they smoke after dinner, after meal. That's really important for them. It's a habit. So in order to change your smoking behavior, you have to get rid of your habit. How do we improve self-control? Doing the right thing at the right time in the right place is important. Can we do something to improve our ability to do that? Psychology has something to say about this. Peter Goldwasser is a German psychologist. He proposed a model or a theory to help us improve our goal commitment and goal-directed behavior. How do you commit to a goal? According to Peter Goldwasser, according to his implementation intention theory, you need to link the goal to specific situations. It's not enough just to make a goal to say, oh, I'm going to get a job. I'm going to get my homework done. Oh, I'm going to get my reading done. You need to be very specific. You need to make the decision that I'm going to get my reading done at this place, at this time. For example, you have the goal of getting a job. It's time for you to look for a job. And then just having the goal is not enough. Having the goal of getting a job is not enough. You have to make implementation intentions. You have to divide the goal into sub-goals. For example, well, getting a job would involve some steps. First, you have to create a resume. And then you need reference letters, probably, and locate potential employers. Of course, you need to look at the recruitment commercials. Who is hiring in your field? Which company has positions opening? And then you have to submit your resumes, application, and then you have to prepare for interviews. All these steps are necessary for getting a job. And each goal takes time, takes effort to complete. How can you improve the possibility that you will get each piece of work done in time rather than procrastinating and dragging your feet? According to Peter Goldwasser, you need to make implementation intentions. That is, completing a resume is not enough. This goal is not enough. You have to tie it with a specific place, context, and time. I'm going to do that in the library this evening. I'm going to the library to write my resume this evening. No delay. And then getting the reference letters. Well, suppose you are a psychology major, you need reference letters from your professors, and you need to decide, I'm going to do that tomorrow in the morning. I'm going to the psychology department, find the professors, ask them for reference letters. and then locate potential employers. How are you going to do that? Search on the web, search on, say, Indeed.ca, or maybe LinkedIn has some resources. Have to be really specific. Which website you are going to search, and when are you going to do that? Tomorrow evening. An interview preparation, how would you prepare for your interviews? Maybe some practices, maybe you have some resources at a university career center or student center. There might be a mentors, counselors, tutors to help you do that, and you have to set a specific time for that. Making these implementation intentions would help you complete your goal. Okay, so that was a brief introduction to motivations. Now, let's talk about emotions. One question psychologists have asked about human emotions is that do all humans have the same emotions, or do different people from different cultures have different emotions? Are some emotions universal? And there's some consensus in this area in psychology. Some emotions are indeed universal. Psychologists mostly agree that disgust, sadness, happiness, fear, anger, and surprise, and these 6 emotions are universal. Universal means that people from all cultures have this kind of emotions, and people from all cultures can understand these emotions. In other words, human experience have some commonalities. We experience some basic emotions that are the same. And these emotions are triggered by the same kind of events, same kind of situation in most cultures. They also have the same facial features, facial expressions, and body language in all cultures. American psychologist Dr. Ekman, Paul Ekman, did a study to show the universal emotions. He took pictures of facial expressions to different parts of the world, different countries, Asia, Africa, Europe, and he even went to visit some Aboriginal people who had very little connection with European culture. Maybe they have never seen a European person. And he showed these pictures of European faces to people from all over the world. Can you recognize this emotion? Can you tell us about what kind of experience this person is having? What kind of event he has experienced? And in all cultures, people recognize these facial expressions. In their particular language, they have words similar to English with meaning, like the first person, this woman on the upper left, oh, she is angry. I think she's angry. And they can label this facial expression. And can you tell a story about what has happened to her to make her have this kind of facial expression? Well, she's offended by some persons. She's offended by some person who took her food without asking her. Or she was offended by some person who stepped on her toe. So offensive behavior would trigger this kind of facial expressions. And like this one in the lower left, most people from most cultures would be able to label this emotion, facial expression correctly. She's feeling disgust. well, what kind of situation, what kind of contact would trigger this kind of responses? Most people in most cultures would be able to say, well, she saw something very, very disgusting, very nasty, very unpleasant. Maybe she saw an injury, a wound with blood, or maybe she saw somebody vomiting. Maybe she saw some feces, etc. And happiness. Happiness is, of course, a universal emotion. People from all over the world have this kind of emotion, can experience it, and people are happy about common things all over the world. When you get something you want, you are happy. So people from all over the world display these emotions, and they can recognize these facial expressions. This level of research shows that facial expression and body language is very important. It's a big part of emotions. In humans, facial expressions are probably the most easy to recognize signals of emotion. Why are there universal emotions? Why do humans have the same kind of emotions? Evolutionary theory has a very good explanation. According to Charles Darwin, the expression of emotions in humans was inherited from our animal ancestors due to their adaptive functions in survival. Emotions are useful. Emotions help people survive. And this is from the evolutionary history. For example, fear. Fear in animals is very useful. Our pre-human ancestors, primates like monkeys, most of them are afraid of snakes, poisonous snakes, and some predatory animals like lions, tigers, poisonous spiders. Fear of this kind of dangerous situations was useful for our ancestors to survive. And we, the humans living today, are all descendants from those ancestors, animal ancestors, pre-human ancestors who had been successful enough to leave offspring. We inherited their genes, so we inherited their emotions. Emotions had some useful functions in the evolutionary history. Even negative emotions have a lot of good functions, like anger. So anger is very important for regulating social relations. Suppose if some person or some animal, ancestors of us, has no anger, no ability to experience anger, and what happens to such a person? People would walk all over him or her, and he would not be able to defend him or herself. Being angry is sending a strong signal to other people that you don't like it. Stop it. The evolutionary theory explains universal emotions by the concept of function. We need common conditions in order to survive. So we have common strategies of achieving these conditions. And emotional responses is one of the strategies that humans all over the world use to create favorable conditions for survival and reproduction. Humans are prepared to experience emotions certain emotions in response to certain kind of stimuli. For example, many people are afraid of snakes, and it's easier to create classical conditioning to snakes. In a classical conditioning experiment, you would show a picture of a snake on the screen and then give your subject a shock. Show the picture of snakes, give him a shock. Show the picture of snakes, give him a shock. Maybe you pair this kind of stimulation sometimes, and then you stop the shock. You just show the picture. Just show the picture of snakes. The person, your subject, will feel fearful, will have the fear response. But it's more difficult to create the same classical conditioning effect with flowers. Psychologists have done this. You show the flowers picture and then give the person a shock, pair this stimuli several times, and then you show the flower, just the flower. Well, few people would show the classical conditioning response of fear of flowers. Even after they have been shocked after the flower display several times. So humans are more prepared or pre-wired to fear some stimuli, like poisonous snakes, spiders, darkness. Why? The evolutionary theory goes back to our ancestors to look for explanation. We inherited these fears or intrinsic fears of snakes, spiders, darkness from our ancestors. It was back in millions of years ago that our ancestors, in their life, fear of this kind of animals and situations helped them to survive. Helped them to survive long enough to have offspring and then pass on the genes encoding this kind of fears to us. Let's look at the components of emotions. Emotions in humans have 4 components. Number 1, it is a subjective feeling. It is a feeling. You feel it. You know when you are angry, and you know it when you are fearful. You know it when you are happy. The easiest way to get some knowledge about how a person is feeling is just ask him. You ask him how he feels. How are you? We do this all the time. You see your friend in the morning, you ask him, how are you? How are you feeling? And then the second component of human emotion is a cognitive reaction. Emotion really involves thinking, especially in humans. When you have fear, you wonder, what are you afraid of? The cognitive component of fear and anxiety is usually related with worries. Are there something you are worrying about? Are you worried about your health, the coronavirus infection? Are you worried about, your job, financial situations, income? Fear is a cognitive reaction to some threat or danger or loss of something you value. The third component of emotional reaction is physical, is bodily reactions. It involves the glands, hormones, and internal organs. Some emotional reactions create high arousal. For example, happiness and anxiety, they both are related with high arousal. Your heart pounds, your breath quickens and your blood pressure increases. You feel excited. Some emotions are involved with low arousal. For example, sadness, depression is a lower arousal state. You feel low energy. And these arousal states are related with the nervous system, in particular with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and involve a lot of hormone effects. Anxiety is related with the adrenal gland. Still another component of human emotions is behavior reactions. There are typical behaviors in most emotions. When you are happy, you laugh. When you're sad, you cry. When you're fearful, you withdraw and tremble. Of course, there are emotional stimuli that reliably produce human emotions. Danger and threat usually create fearfulness. And good things, winning the lottery, getting good grades, positive outcomes usually create positive emotions like happiness.